They bulldozed my grandmother's prized garden for a clubhouse. I remember the exact moment I stumbled onto that horrific sight and felt my stomach drop. It was a crisp fall morning in Littleton, Virginia. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke, and I'd driven back to my family's homestead expecting to see the old vegetable patches and flowering vines that had once defined my childhood. Instead, I found a towering structure of steel beams and brand new lumber rising out of the ground, a monstrosity of half-finished walls and gleaming glass panels. The sign posted out front read Greenbrier Estates, HOA, Future Grand Clubhouse, complete with a rendering of an opulent two-story building and neatly manicured hedges. My eyes darted to the large gravel lot strewn with construction materials, bulldozers, and a line of concrete trucks. Where had my grandmother's beloved garden gone? That was the heart-stopping question pounding in my mind. She'd passed away 2 years prior, leaving the property to me with strict instructions: never sell, never subdivide, and never let them pave over my garden. She'd worked that soil every day until her joints ached. It was more than just a patch of land. It was her legacy, the symbol of our family's roots in this town. And now, it was gone, obliterated to make way for a clubhouse that the local homeowners association apparently deemed essential. Even worse, a quick glance told me that more than half of the new structure rose directly from the ground where her vegetables and perennials had thrived. I parked my car near a temporary chain-link fence, stepping over piles of uprooted plants and broken masonry. A construction worker in a neon vest spotted me and barked something about a hard hat area, but I ignored him. At the fence line, I noticed a battered wooden sign my grandmother had once hammered into the garden bed: "Welcome to Granny's." It lay face down, splattered with mud. My anger flared and I called out to the nearest worker, voice shaking. "Who authorized this construction? This is private property." The man shrugged, gesturing at a laminated notice posted on a fence post. I yanked it free, scanning the text: "Per approval from Greenbrier Estates, HOA." My grandmother's address was clearly listed, but the wording claimed that this portion of property had been merged into the association's communal space. Communal space? My family had never been part of Greenbrier Estates. We were an older, standalone homestead that predated that entire neighborhood. None of this made sense. I demanded answers, but the worker just stared at me blankly. He was a hired contractor, not a manager. I left him sputtering protests as I walked onto the construction site, searching for someone in charge. My heart pounded with every step, and beneath my anger lay a twist of guilt. I had been away from Littleton for a couple of years, taking a new job in DCC job that ironically involved auditing local government finances and investigating potential corruption. My grandmother had insisted I go, said it was my calling to keep communities honest. Now, seeing her cherished garden turned into a construction zone, I wondered if I'd failed her. Perhaps if I'd stayed, I could have stopped this. Before I could corner another worker, a woman's voice sliced through the chaos. "Excuse me, you can't be here." A sharp-dressed figure in a navy blue power suit strode across the construction lot, stepping over rebar as if she owned the place. She looked around 50, with precisely styled blonde hair and an expression that combined politeness and condescension in equal measure. She wore a small pinned badge that read, "HOA President." "You're trespassing," she declared, hands on her hips. "This is an active work site, and I happen to be in charge here. Sylvia Roberts, president of the Greenbrier Estates Homeowners Association." Her voice had that polished edge typical of someone used to bossing neighbors around. I stared at her, fists clenched. "I'm trespassing," I repeated, barely keeping my fury in check. "This is my property, or at least it was. I'm Jason Garrett, the grandson of the woman who owned this land for decades. I want to know why there's a clubhouse in the middle of her garden." Sylvia looked momentarily startled, her gaze flickered with uncertainty. Then she let out a thin, dismissive laugh. "Ah, you're Mr. Garrett. We tried contacting you months ago. Didn't you receive our notices about the annexation of this parcel? Your grandmother was a longtime resident, and to keep property values consistent, the association resolved—" I cut her off. "Resolved? You can't just resolve to take someone's land. There's no chance my grandmother agreed to that. She despised HOAs and always refused their buyout offers. I remembered the times my grandmother had complained about Greenbrier Estates wanting a piece of her property for a tennis court or a walking path, and how she told them to keep off her land. Sylvia's smile turned chilly. We have documents proving that Ms. Garrett consented to annexation of the garden plot before her passing. It's all recorded with the county. We're perfectly within our rights to build this clubhouse. If you have a problem, you're free to bring it up at our next HOA board meeting, by appointment only. I stared at her in disbelief. My grandmother had never signed anything like that, not once. She was too proud of her independence, and the orchard, the vegetable patches, the roses. The very notion felt absurd. Where is this so-called consent? I asked, voice trembling with controlled rage. Sylvia pursed her lips. Check the county records. They'll confirm it. Now, if you don't mind, I really must ask you to leave. This site is dangerous and we don't want liability issues. I wanted to hurl every curse word I'd learned since middle school, but I clenched my jaw and stomped away. My mind was whirling. If there was some forged document, I needed to find it and tear it down. On my way to the county recorder's office, I called an old friend, Benjamin Ben Solis, a local attorney who had helped me file probate documents when my grandmother passed. He answered groggily, complaining that it was too early for crisis calls, but the moment I explained the situation, his tone sharpened. That's insane, he said. She never annexed anything. That garden was her pride. I'll meet you at the records office in an hour. By the time we arrived at the county clerk's desk, I could barely contain my impatience. The clerk, a harried-looking woman named Mrs. Porter, retrieved the relevant deed modification. Sure enough, there was a piece of paper bearing my grandmother's shaky signature, dated mere weeks before her death. It stated she'd annexed her garden parcel to the Greenbrier Estates HOA for beautification and communal development. I felt my blood run cold. My grandmother was in hospice care at that time. She could barely hold a pen, let alone understand complicated legal forms. Someone had forged her signature or taken advantage of her in her final days. Ben's face reddened as he read over the document. This is disgusting, he muttered. Mrs. Porter gave us a sympathetic shrug. I just file what comes in, she said. The notary seal appears legitimate, but if you suspect fraud, you can file a formal complaint. She pushed a sheet of instructions across the counter, the standard county procedure for challenging recorded documents. Back at Ben's law office, we pored over every line of that alleged annexation. The notary who witnessed the signature was a woman named Donna Price, rumored to have connections with various local organizations. If the HOA had bribed or coerced Donna into legitimizing that forgery, it would be a serious legal offense. We spent the rest of the day gathering evidence, scanning old emails, searching for any letter from the HOA or mention of an annexation in my grandmother's records. Nothing. It was as if the entire fiasco materialized out of thin air. Midway through this frenzy of calls and emails, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. Stop digging or you'll regret it. I showed it to Ben, eyebrows raised. Someone's rattled, I said wryly. Maybe I'm hitting too close to the truth already. But deep down I felt the chill of intimidation. Threats could escalate fast in a small town where power and corruption occasionally intersected. That night I stared at the ceiling in my grandmother's old bedroom. I'd come back to Littleton to settle some final estate matters and check on the property. Instead, I discovered the HOA had steamrolled my grandmother's garden. A wave of guilt washed over me. I'd been so busy with my job in D.C., ignoring letters from home, content to think the land was safe. Now, I felt an urgent need to right this wrong. Grandma, I'm sorry. I won't let them get away with this. The next morning, I visited the local planning commission office, hoping to see the building permits for the clubhouse. The staff there kept giving me the runaround, claiming they needed official requests or authorized third-party clearance. My frustration mounted. Then I remembered something crucial. My new job position, the reason I'd come home in the first place. I'd recently been appointed as a junior government auditor for state-level municipal oversight, focusing on fraud, misappropriation, and irregularities in small-town budgets. It was a role with real authority, especially when it came to investigating questionable dealings. I'd originally planned to do most of my auditing remotely, pulling files and financial statements. But now, I realized I had the perfect vantage point to dive deeper into the HOA's finances and possible corruption. It was time to leverage that authority. I flashed my credentials at the Planning Commission's desk. I'm Jason Garrett, a newly assigned government auditor for the statewide Municipal Oversight Department. I'm requesting immediate access to the building permits for the Greenbrier Estates HOA Clubhouse project. The staff's eyes widened and they scrambled to comply. Within minutes, I had a folder of stamped documents in my hands, each referencing budget lines, inspection waivers, and suspicious fast-track approvals. Something smelled off. The project costs were itemized in a cryptic manner, listing inflated prices for landscaping, environmental compliance, and legal consultation. Even more peculiar, each line item was approved by a signature that looked eerily like Sylvia Roberts's. I wondered if she had strong ties to certain officials who had turned a blind eye to these discrepancies. Later that day, I rendezvoused with Ben at a local coffee shop, handing over the permits. He whistled low, scanning the suspicious budget lines. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a $40,000 expense for garden removal and land clearing. 40 grand to tear up your grandmother's garden? That's an outrageous sum, especially in a small town. We speculated that someone was funneling money into personal pockets or paying hush money to keep the project afloat. Regardless, it was the crack we needed. Evidence that the clubhouse construction might not just be ethically wrong, but legally and financially crooked. Meanwhile, the clubhouse progressed at a breakneck pace. Sylvia's crew poured cement, erected roof trusses, and installed an ostentatious stone facade. Every time I drove past, I felt a surge of anger, picturing the rows of daisies and tomato vines that had once thrived there. A sign out front now read, "Coming soon, state-of-the-art amenities for Greenbrier residents, elevate your lifestyle." It was enough to make me sick. I decided to approach the HOA board directly, requesting to speak at their next meeting. The board met every second Thursday in a cramped conference room at the local library. The atmosphere when I arrived felt hostile. Board members huddled near a corner, whispering among themselves. Sylvia was at the head table, wearing that same controlled smile. A few residents sat in plastic chairs, clearly more concerned about fence height regulations than massive land grab. When they reached the agenda item labeled Public Comments, I stood up. "Good evening," I began, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I'm Jason Garrett, grandson of the late Rose Garrett, who owned the property where you're now building a clubhouse. I have serious concerns about the legitimacy of this construction." A hush fell over the room. Sylvia's eyes narrowed. I pressed on. "I also happen to be the newly appointed government auditor for local municipal finances. I've noticed irregularities in your building permits and budget statements." One of the board members, an older gentleman with a thick mustache, shifted uneasily. Another, a young woman who seemed more sympathetic, leaned forward as if curious. Sylvia's lips pressed tight. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "we appreciate your concern, but the HOA has all the proper approvals. If you have a dispute over property ownership, you can pursue that legally. This is not the place to disrupt official association business." I refused to back down. "I have evidence suggesting my grandmother's signature was forged. Your budget for the project is riddled with inconsistencies. As the assigned government auditor, I'm well within my rights to investigate potential misuse of funds or fraudulent dealings." Murmurs rippled through the room. I spotted a flicker of panic on a couple of board members' faces. Perhaps they'd gone along with Sylvia's plan, never expecting real scrutiny. Sylvia tried to dismiss me, saying time was up, but I hammered in one last statement. "I'll be filing an official complaint with the county, seeking an injunction on further construction. If any of you have knowledge of wrongdoing and cooperate, it could help your case." I left the library feeling both triumphant and uneasy, wondering if I'd just painted a target on my back. Sure enough, that evening I received another anonymous text. "Stay out of HOA business if you know what's good for you." I half expected a brick through my car window next. It was eerily reminiscent of the intimidation tactics I'd seen in bigger corruption cases. This is bigger than a typical HOA dispute, I realized. Maybe they'd poured so much money into the clubhouse that they'd do anything to protect it. Over the next week, I methodically compiled a report detailing the budget discrepancies, questionable land annexation, and possible forgery. Meanwhile, Ben prepared a civil lawsuit challenging the annexation's legality. We also discovered that the notary, Donna Price, had apparently performed an unusually large number of property notarizations for Sylvia Roberts over the past 6 months. A pattern emerged. Every time the HOA needed a signature or approval that might be contested, Donna Price was the notary of record. The day we filed the lawsuit, I paid a surprise visit to Donna's small notary office downtown. She looked jittery, eyes darting around as if expecting a confrontation. My tone was calm but pointed. "I'm investigating the authenticity of my grandmother's signature on an annexation form you notarized," I said. Donna's hand shook slightly, fiddling with a pen. "Everything was legal," she insisted. "Sylvia said, she said Miss Garrett had trouble signing but wanted to finalize it." My mind flashed to the possibility that my grandmother was incapacitated, possibly manipulated. "So you physically witnessed her sign?" I pressed. Donna hesitated, then repeated her canned line. "Everything was legal." I could smell the lie. "You realize," I warned, "that notarizing a forged document is a serious offense. My position as a government auditor means I can elevate this to a criminal inquiry. If you were coerced, now's the time to speak up." Donna's eyes flickered with fear. For a split second I thought she might crack, but she held firm. "I'm sorry, I have nothing else to add." That evening a tip arrived in my email from an unknown sender. "Look into the board's party fund. They're hiding expenses." It included a snippet of a spreadsheet listing Clubhouse launch gala, $15,000. A secret party fund? This smelled like a slush fund. If the board was using HOA dues for personal entertainment, that could be illegal or, at the very least, grounds for serious penalties. I cross-referenced the spreadsheet entries with the public documents from the Planning Commission. Sure enough, there was no mention of a gala in the official budget. They were cooking the books. When I next stepped onto the homestead, the so-called Grand Clubhouse was nearing completion. The skeleton of the building was fully enclosed and interior work had started. Plumbing, electrical, custom finishes. My grandmother's rose bushes were replaced by a decorative fountain under construction. It felt surreal. Neighbors drove by, some curious, others likely counting down to the day they could sip cocktails in their new clubhouse. Yet none of them realized it stood on stolen land. One late afternoon, as I was photographing the site for evidence, a timid middle-aged woman approached from the sidewalk. She introduced herself as Linda Fowler, an HOA board member who had voted against the clubhouse but was outnumbered. In a hushed tone, she told me that Sylvia and a small inner circle had orchestrated the entire annexation, promising the other board members it was fully legit. Linda wanted no part in forging a signature. "I'm so sorry about your grandmother," she whispered. "I suspected something shady, but they kept us in the dark. Please, don't mention my name. I'm scared of retaliation." I assured her I'd keep her identity private, but asked if she'd testify if needed. She bit her lip, clearly torn. "We'll see," she said, handing me a folder of internal HOA memos. Reading those memos was like peering into a nest of vipers. They referenced consolidating additional land for future expansions, offsetting budget shortfalls with special assessments, and unbelievably, avoiding mandatory environmental review by labeling the land as pre-developed. My grandmother's beloved garden had never been pre-developed, but if they labeled it that way on county forms, they could skip an environmental impact study. The more I read, the more I realized the sheer audacity of Sylvia's scheme. Armed with these documents, I looped in my state-level auditing colleagues. They confirmed that if the HOA had manipulated county records or embezzled association funds, we could freeze their accounts pending an investigation. The next step was to get an emergency hearing in front of a judge, seeking a restraining order to halt final construction. Ben filed the motion. citing irreparable harm to private property and potential criminal fraud. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, a lightning pace by typical legal standards, but we had enough evidence to make it urgent. As the hearing approached, I became hyper-vigilant. Threatening messages continued trickling in, each one more menacing. One anonymous note taped to my car read, "Drop the lawsuit or watch your back." The stress kept me awake at night. But my grandmother's memory fueled my determination. The line had been crossed the moment they bulldozed her garden. I'd faced down corporate crooks in DC before. I could handle a power-hungry HOA. Okay. And handled a power-hungry. When the hearing day arrived, the county courthouse buzzed with tension. Residents packed the gallery, local news reporters hovered in the hallway, and HOA board members whispered among themselves. Sylvia sat at the defense table, flanked by two attorneys in expensive suits. I recognized one as a high-powered real estate lawyer known for burying opponents in paperwork. Ben and I laid out our case. The suspicious annexation with a likely forged signature, the shady notary situation, the inflated project costs, and the hidden party fund. I stepped forward to highlight my role as a government auditor. I described how the association's financial records appeared altered, how multiple line items lacked legitimate invoices, and how everything pointed to a cover-up. Then I'm requesting an immediate injunction to stop further construction and a thorough investigation into the HOA's finances, I concluded, my voice echoing through the courtroom. Sylvia's attorneys hit back, claiming the land was legally annexed with Ms. Garrett's blessing and that I was exploiting my auditor position for a personal vendetta. Sylvia feigned innocence, painting a picture of a misunderstanding over the annexation paperwork. She insisted the clubhouse was for the good of the community. They tried to cast me as a meddling outsider. But then came the twist. Linda Fowler, the board member who'd approached me, had quietly decided to testify. She took the stand, voice quavering yet determined. Under oath, she revealed the behind-the-scenes pressure Sylvia exerted on the board, how they'd never seen original proof of my grandmother's consent, and how suspiciously fast the annexation was pushed through. She even mentioned that Sylvia bragged about having friends in high places, so no one would dare to question the document. The courtroom murmured. Sylvia's face reddened and her attorneys glared daggers at Linda. But the damage was done. When the judge asked if there was any official compliance with environmental or planning regulations, Sylvia's attorneys sidestepped. They offered a vague reference to county approvals. That's when I took the opportunity to note the missing environmental study. My grandmother's garden contained old-growth rose bushes, organic vegetables, and a small orchard, an area sometimes designated as farmland or horticultural heritage. The judge's eyebrows rose. "Are you telling me they classified this garden as pre-developed land?" she asked. I nodded. Sylvia's attorneys had no credible response. After hours of arguments, the judge made a preliminary ruling. She granted an injunction to halt further construction on the clubhouse, pending a full investigation into the annexation, the finances, and the notary's involvement. The gallery erupted in chatter. Sylvia stormed out with her attorneys, ignoring reporters' questions. I caught her eye as she left, and the rage etched on her face told me she wouldn't go down quietly. Within days, a county inspector shut down the construction site. The half-finished clubhouse loomed eerily, a testament to the HOA's overreach. Meanwhile, a swirl of rumors about forged signatures, crooked notaries, and secret funds enveloped Greenbrier Estates. Some residents were outraged, having funded the clubhouse through raised dues. Others demanded Sylvia step down as president. Yet Sylvia clung to power, issuing statements that she'd fight the baseless accusations. They then demanded that she'd fight the baseless accusations. This conflict soon extended beyond the courtroom. My auditing team discovered anomalies in the local building department's ledgers, notes about expedited approval fees and off-the-record transactions. It looked like bribes had been paid to expedite the clubhouse permits. The local newspaper ran an exposé, quoting an unnamed whistleblower from the building department who claimed Sylvia had personally delivered envelopes of cash in exchange for bypassing standard procedures. The story ignited a firestorm of controversy. Calls flooded the mayor's office demanding an anti-corruption probe. One evening, while I was reviewing more files, a loud crash jolted me. Someone had smashed the window of my truck parked outside. I dashed out, but the culprit had fled, leaving behind a rock with a crudely painted message, "Stop or else." My stomach twisted. I reported it to the sheriff, who took my statement but seemed reluctant to delve deeper. "HOA disputes can get heated," he said lamely, "but I'll note it." Fear coiled in my gut, but so did anger. Threats would only strengthen my resolve. At the next hearing, the judge addressed new evidence from the state auditing office: irregularities in the HOA's expense reports, personal reimbursements disguised as clubhouse improvements, and even money used to pay for a fancy board retreat that was never disclosed to members. Sylvia's attorneys tried to protest, claiming irrelevance, but the judge insisted on hearing it. With each revelation, the noose tightened around Sylvia's ambitions. Then came the bombshell, an official statement from the notary, Donna Price. After intense pressure and the looming threat of felony charges, Donna had agreed to cooperate. She admitted that Sylvia approached her with a half-completed form, claimed Miss Garrett was on her deathbed, but insisted on annexing the garden for the good of the community. Donna confessed she never actually saw Miss Garrett sign the document. She'd notarized it at Sylvia's request, hoping to maintain favor with the HOA. Gasps filled the courtroom. Sylvia sank lower in her seat, glaring at Donna as if she'd committed the ultimate betrayal. The forgery angle was now undeniable. The judge's expression hardened, and she demanded an immediate investigation into potential criminal fraud. Realizing the tide had turned, a few of Sylvia's staunchest allies on the board began cutting deals with the county prosecutor, turning over emails that showed how Sylvia orchestrated the land grab. In those emails, she callously referred to my grandmother's property as the best spot for a showstopper clubhouse. She'd promised the board it would drive up property values, meaning bigger HOA dues, and more power for those at the top. As the legal drama crescendoed, we learned that Sylvia had a side arrangement with a local developer who'd funded part of the construction in exchange for future condo expansions around the clubhouse. They planned to bulldoze more of my grandmother's homestead if the initial build succeeded. The sheer greed was astounding. Finally, after weeks of legal wrangling, the judge issued her ruling. The annexation was voided, the garden parcel reverted fully to my family's estate, and the HOA was ordered to demolish or remove any parts of the clubhouse that encroached on our land. Additionally, the court froze all HOA bank accounts until an independent forensic audit could be completed. Sylvia, facing multiple allegations of fraud, resigned from her position as president, practically dragging her attorneys behind her. As she left the courthouse, local news cameras pounced. She offered a terse no comment. The sense of triumph was tempered by sadness for my grandmother's destroyed garden. The damage had already been done, the soil churned, the roses uprooted. But the land remained ours at least. The court's order forced the HOA to tear down the half-built structure, removing every last cinder block and steel beam from the garden site. Every day for a week, trucks hauled away debris. Ironically, the same bulldozers that had destroyed her plants were now dismantling the clubhouse walls. I couldn't help but see it as a poetic sort of justice, albeit bittersweet. In the aftermath, my role as a government auditor gained local respect. Many residents thanked me for exposing the HOA's corruption. Some apologized for believing Sylvia's propaganda that I was just a troublemaker out to ruin their community. The new interim HOA board publicly apologized for the fiasco and agreed to reimburse members for the wasted dues. The developer who funded the project vanished back into whatever shadows he crawled from, likely nursing a hefty financial loss. As for me, I spent the next few months working to restore my grandmother's garden. The soil was compacted and littered with rubble, so I hired a landscaping crew to remove construction debris, reintroduce fresh topsoil, and replant some of my grandmother's favorite flowers. It would never look exactly the same, but I hope to honor her memory by reviving at least a portion of that once bountiful paradise. I also installed a simple wooden bench with a plaque that read, "In loving memory of Rose Garrett, tend the earth and it will tend you back." Sylvia faced charges of forgery and misappropriation of funds, Donna Price testified against her, claiming she'd been intimidated and manipulated, though some suspected she was also complicit. Ultimately, local prosecutors pursued felony fraud charges. Whispers said Sylvia might cut a plea deal, but either way, her reputation in Littleton was beyond repair. In the end, justice was served, and the community witnessed how greed and arrogance could topple even a confident HOA president. My grandmother's garden, though battered, would bloom again, and the lesson learned was clear. No matter how powerful they think they are, no matter how many favors they collect, bullies who trample on someone else's legacy will eventually face the consequences. As I look back, I can't help but reflect on how perfect the timing was. I became the very government auditor assigned to uncover local financial corruption, returning to find my grandmother's land under siege. It's almost as if fate, or my grandmother herself, orchestrated it from beyond, ensuring her final wish was honored. The HOA built a grand clubhouse over her garden, never suspecting they'd dug themselves into a hole they couldn't escape, and once their lies were exposed, they found themselves well and truly trapped.